Hello everyone, and thank you for joining us today for this webinar, held as part of the VBA's Practitioner Education Series. I'm Luke Hamblin, the team leader of the Technical and Regulation Building team, and I'll be your host today. Please note that we are running a hybrid webinar today that includes live streaming of educational content with interactive polls and live Q&As answered by our technical team. I encourage you all to please type your questions into the Q&A chat function during the live streaming, and also to participate in the interactive polls when they appear on your screen. Today's webinar is a rescreening of a webinar we showed in June of last year. It's on the topic of energy efficiency for Volume 2 of the NCC 2022. Although the PowerPoint content of this webinar is being rescreened, we will be answering newly pre-submitted questions live towards the end of the webinar. And we will also, of course, have our technical team on hand to answer any questions that you have in the interactive chat function. Any relevant questions that are not getting answered today will be responded to in around 2 weeks as we publish our Q&A responses. So without further delay, please enjoy this webinar.
I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet today and pay my respect to the elders past and present. I extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders people attending the session today. Today you will hear from Sean Braden. Sean has 15 years building surveying experience in Western Australia and Victoria. He is a registered unlimited building surveyor in Western Australia. Sean has experience in approvals as well as regulatory policy work for both local and state government. As Victoria's building and plumbing regulator, the VBA is committed to ensuring a confident and thriving industry and collaborates with stakeholders to enhance practitioner competency and deliver improved outcomes for the community. We have a role in ensuring practitioners understand how to do things correctly and in discouraging risky, harmful or illegal behaviour in the building and plumbing industries. Today's webinar will be about NCC 2022 Energy Efficiency Volume 2. Just some housekeeping. I'd like to let you know that this session is being recorded. We are introducing a hybrid webinar where we are live streaming learning content with interactive polls and Q&A answered by our technical team. And the link to this presentation will be made available on our website along with previous webinars. Please still submit your questions via the Q&A chat function during the webinar, as our technical team is still available to answer your questions in the chat room. At the end of the presentation, we will be answering some pre-submitted questions during the Q&A session. Also, during the webinar, we will be conducting live polls that will automatically appear on your screens. Please feel free to also use the QR codes referenced on the slides to direct you to the relevant websites relating to the topic being presented today. Just a reminder, due to the large volume of questions we received during the live streaming of the learning content, we will do our best to answer as many of these questions as possible. After the hybrid webinar, we will collate all the unanswered questions and will provide an answer to as many of these as possible. Again, a copy of the questions and answer will be sent out with your proof of attendance certificate in the weeks following this hybrid webinar. Sean, I will now hand it over to you.
Thank you, Anna. We'll jump straight in. So today, the purpose of the webinar and why it's important. So we're going to discuss compliance with the NCC 2022, and we're going to look at the changes through NCC 2022, and we're going to do that in a way that supports what ABCB's webinars have done in the past. Importantly, we're going to take a regulatory focus on this, and we're going to go through the compliance pathways in the NCC fundamentally. And as we go, there's going to be a lot of questions that we'll be answering about the changes in NCC 2022. At the end of the session, you're going to have an improved, bigger picture understanding of compliance with energy efficiency and have an understanding of the changes to energy efficiency. So the scope of today is purely going to be focused on Class 1 and Class 10 buildings through NCC Volume 2, and we're just going to be addressing the energy efficiency provisions alone. The content and the structure of it, we'll go through an overview, and then our usuals, our performance requirement, our DTS revisions, and our performance solutions, as well as our governing requirements on top of that. And lastly, we'll look at the transitions from 2019 into 2022. So we'll start off with the compliance overview. And starting with the overview, it's important to have a look at the objectives and the functional statements that are included in the code. And these are cut and paste straight from the code. But what we've done here is we've highlighted the change in that. So previously, it was a lot around reducing greenhouse gas emissions, but now we start to see things like reducing energy consumption during peak demand periods, and importantly, improving occupant health and amenity. So that's a really big change. Yes, these are not mandatory, so they're the non-mandatory part of the code, but it does give you a really good sense as to why the subject matter is important and why we're here discussing it today effectively. So if we look at NCC compliance, we've got the fundamental clause that tells you what NCC compliance actually is. So A2G1, I like to call it my favourite clause in the NCC. That says compliance with the NCC is achieved if you satisfy the governing requirements as well as the performance requirements. So in terms of energy efficiency, we have changes in both governing requirements and performance requirements. So your governing requirements cover things like your definitions, documentation that's going to be referenced, state variations, and so on. And our performance requirements are that compliance threshold that we need to achieve through a DTS or a performance solution. So energy efficiency is no different. To get a compliant solution, we need to satisfy A2G1 and cover off our governing requirements and our performance requirements. So we'll jump in and we'll have a closer look at the performance requirements and then how we're going to satisfy those by DTS and performance. But to start with, we'll have a look straight at the performance requirements and the changes. And here we have the move from 2019 into 2022. So 2019, we had two performance requirements being building and services, so the fabric of the building and the services associated with it. Moving across into 2022, we've got thermal performance, which is very much the same concept as building, and we've got energy usage, which again is very similar to services, but we've got a different layer applied on top of that as well. The critical change from 2019 to 2022 is the change in which the performance requirements are worded or put together. So 2019, we were very qualitative. So we had the phrases such as to the degree necessary or appropriate to, those kind of ones that were very open to interpretation and could be applied in numerous ways. Moving into 2022, we get very much into a quantitative state. So we see wording such as must not exceed, and then we have a numerical value limit. So we're really firm on what compliance actually is through that performance requirement now. Through the change, we've also had an emphasis on the energy usage, which then opens us up to the whole of home TCS pathway. So the change to H6P2 allows for that introduction to the whole of home, which we'll get to later on. But here we have an example of one of the performance requirements, H6P1, thermal performance. And you can see here, the total heating load, total cooling load, or total energy load must not exceed the load limit specified in specification 44. So that spec 44 gives a variety of things. So how do we calculate what values the calculation is going to be, megajoules per metre squared, and talks about a variety of different terms, heating degree hour, cooling degree hour, and so on. But ultimately, they provide thermal loads. Now, these aren't new. We've seen these through the NATA's pathway previously for a number of years, but they're new in the sense that they've worked into the actual quantified performance requirements. So if we look at the two performance requirements, H6P1, H6P2, they're quantified now. So how do we satisfy them? We're all probably familiar with this diagram. We've seen it 1,000 times, no doubt. Our performance requirements are satisfied either through a performance solution and or a deemed to satisfy solution. So one or the other. If we look at a performance solution, there's two ways to go about it. We can do a first principles approach, which is looking at that performance requirement detailed, calculating those loads, making sure it does not exceed what's limited there. Or we can do a comparison to DTS. If we cross over into deemed to satisfy, the deemed to satisfy is a mechanism that says it's deemed to have met the performance requirement. So it's a mechanism that goes through. So we get to our first question, fairly tough one in some cases. Do I need to quantify the performance requirement in every situation, be that performance solution or DTS? And then the answer to that is no. We only need to do that quantifying through one particular performance solution pathway, being a first principles approach. So if you're going to do first principles and address the performance requirement as it's written, then you are going to need to quantify those values. But if you're doing a DTS or you're going to do an equivalence to DTS performance solution, you're not going to need to quantify those values. So now we'll have a look at the DTS provisions and how we're going to achieve compliance through that and satisfy our performance requirements. So the compliance mechanism for DTS is largely unchanged. We've got the mechanism here. So previously it was Part 3.12.0 in NCC 2019 talks about your DTS provisions, the application of part and how you satisfy those performance requirements. Moving into 2022, we've got H6D1 and H6D2. So H6D1 is the linkage between the DTS and the performance requirement, just combines them both to make sure there's a clear pathway. And H6D2 is the application of the part. So they are the most critical parts in achieving DTS compliance and being aware that these are the pathway to get there. If we look at the thermal performance requirement, H6P1, so there are two options of how we're going to go about this. So H6D2 explains exactly what's going to be needed in each case. So we've got two options being an NATA star rating or an elemental provisions. Now you only have to select one out of these two. You don't have to comply with both. But if you're looking to satisfy H6P1 and you want to know what you actually need to do, H6D2 gives you the exact detail of what needs to be adhered to, what needs to be complied with to satisfy that performance requirement. So that is a really important clause within the NCC. If we go down the NATA's pathway, compliance is, well, compliance out of the code talks about compliance with specification 42 using house energy rating software. House energy rating software is software that complies with the NATA scheme. And then if we dive further into spec 42, that's where we start to see the increases in stringency that we've got. So we're going from a 6-star to a 7-star, as well as heating and cooling loads have been revised in the ABCB standard. The stringency change, there is a lot of discussion around that and how industry actually gets to a standard or a place where that stringency change is easy. And a lot of the feedback coming through is the energy assessment needs to be considered as early as possible through the design process to enable good design. Then we're not up-speccing drastically and costing too much money and all those kind of questions that come in. But we'll talk about that later on in the Q&A session. Under Spec 42, there is additional requirements that need to be adhered with. So we've got insulation. So the installation of insulation comes into that. We talk about thermal breaks, compensation for ceiling penetrations such as exhaust fans, downlights, floor edge, and building ceiling comes into it. So your 7-star report is not going to be a cover-all. There's still a number of DTS clauses that have to be complied with on top of that report. But that hasn't really changed from 2019 through to 2022. Now, the elemental pathway exists still. So we've got the fundamentals of the building. So our building fabric, our glazing, our building ceiling. And probably the difference with the elemental pathway is that the elemental provisions have a far greater limitation in their scope to what they used to be in the past. So there's situations where particular colours on an external wall for solar absorbance or an eave overhang or a wall height may mean that it's going to be outside the scope of the elemental pathway. Now, that doesn't push it into a DTS, into a performance solution territory. It just potentially removes the ability for you to use the elemental pathway, and you can use the NATAS pathway instead. But just be mindful that there are a lot of limitations in that use of the elemental. Now, if we switch over and have a look at the second performance requirement, we've got H6P2 for energy usage. And again, the H6D2, the application of part, is probably the most critical clause in Part H6 because it tells you exactly what needs to be complied with to satisfy the performance requirement. And here we have two different options of complying. So we've got a NATAS rating, and we see there the clause, and we've got a manual calculation, and we've got the clause and the requirements in there too. So we've got the software and a manual process. But again, reiterate, H6D2, the application of part, is the fundamental key to make sure that you satisfy your performance requirement. So if we look at the new NATAS pathway for energy usage, we've got, again, compliance with Spec 42 and using house energy rating software or software accredited under the NATAS scheme. When we go into Spec 42, we get the value of what we must achieve, which is a whole of home rating of not less than 60. And on the right-hand side of the screen, you can see what that is actually going to look like on the report. In addition to this, you still need to comply with Part 13.7 for services, which is very similar to the 2019 NCC edition. So the beauty of the manual calculation is that it has a broader, I should say, the beauty of a NATAS software calculation is it's got a broader calculation and broader parameters to the manual calculation. So this diagram from NATAS gives a really good indication of what it looks like. So firstly, we take into consideration the performance of the shell of the building, and then we go into our calculation looking at heating and cooling appliances, hot water, lighting, pool and spa equipment, and then offsetting by on-site generation such as solar PV. The manual calculation doesn't necessarily go into assessing the building's shell. This is what gives NATAS the sort of the point of difference between the two. Now, important to note that yes, it does assess the thermal shell of the building, but that's just as a base level calculation and process. It doesn't mean that these offset each other and vice versa. So if we look at the manual calculation, we've got compliance with 13.6 for whole of home energy usage, and again, we've got our 13.7 for services. So compliance with 13.6 talks about calculation A mustn't exceed calculation B. So calculation A talks about your floor area, heating, cooling equipment, and so on. And then calculation B is your floor area and energy factors on top of that. So there's a really defined calculation through the code for that. The limitations are you can't use it on floor area that's greater than 500 square metres. And to make life easy, ABCB has put out a calculator that will do that calculation for you. If you're looking to input the values to it, we've got numerous tables within Part 13.6 of the housing provisions, plus ABCB has a standard, the whole of home energy factors standard. Now that standard does offer a degree of flexibility, and you can see we've got an example here. So picking factors from the closest rating that could be chosen from the tables. If you're going to use that flexibility, the advice is to read the ABCB standard for whole of home energy factors in detail, and the front end of that talks about where you can and can't use that flexibility. But it is important to note there is a degree of flexibility built into that. So the next quick quiz, if NATAS is used for thermal performance, is it mandatory to use NATAS for energy usage? So thermal performance being H6P1 and energy usage being performance requirement H6P2. And the answer is no. They're separate performance requirements and they have a separate DTS pathway, which we discussed under H6D2. So there's nothing that's going to mandate you using the NATAS for energy usage when you've done a NATAS 7-star. So you can still use a manual calculation if you choose to. Important to note that performance requirements are separate and they can be satisfied through their own mechanism. And that's the DTS that we're going to cover. Again, we've really just focused on how do we get that regulatory compliance rather than going into a lot of detail around different clauses that the ABCB did. So now we'll look at performance solutions. So the performance solution pathway, again, has remained largely unchanged. So we've got two different options for satisfying a performance solution, and that's first principles, where we go directly against the performance requirement and assess it that way, or we've got an equivalent to DTS. So your performance solution will be influenced by these quantified performance requirements, and the word is influence because it just depends on which pathway that you take. If you're taking a first principles approach, then the effect is rather great because you have to actually calculate the values. But if you're using an equivalence to DTS, you may not actually need to calculate the values, so it may remain somewhat the same. Probably the good rule of thumb when you're looking at performance solutions and the outcomes of those are that in theory, your quantified performance requirements, your NATAS DTS approach and your DTS elemental approach should generate consistent outcomes. They're not going to be absolutely identical, but they should be quite consistent and very close to each other. So if you're assessing a performance solution and you see, for example, a heating and cooling load that seems ridiculously different to a NATAS DTS approach, then you may need to ask questions and say, seek a peer review or the like. It doesn't necessarily mean it is compliant or not, but it gives you an avenue to explore that performance solution in greater detail. The first principles approach, we've got H6P1 and we've got a requirement through Spec 44 and H6P2, we talk about GEMS determination and the like. Now, there is going to be further guidance about how you quantify these in the future, but a first principles approach performance solution is not a common type performance solution. So a lot of the guidance was focused on other things such as DTS and so on. But like I say, it's likely that these are going to be, there'll be more information coming available in the future. Equivalence to DTS. So we're relying on calculations showing that equivalence, and there's multiple ways that it can be achieved. But probably one way that we all have seen and know in the past is your verification method. So verification using a reference building or verb under H6V2 gives us a really robust process of how we can show equivalence to DTS. That process uses an alternative software to NATAS, and we're using DTS elemental provisions to calculate the thermal loads, and then we're comparing that through the reference process. So a common question that we get asked as well is about there's limited DTS elemental provisions. So can I still use the verb H6V2 in most situations? And the answer is yes, because H6V2 clarifies a process of establishing those heating and cooling loads. So H6V2.3 has to be read really carefully because it sets out the parameters of what needs to be identical and what doesn't necessarily need to be identical. So if you're going to use it, read that clause really carefully. So in most cases, you can still use the DTS elementals to establish your heating and cooling loads. It doesn't have to be identical to the proposed building. So it's still an option. But again, ensuring that you read that verification method in its full detail is important. Always remember, any performance solution needs to be appropriately documented and really has to show how compliance is achieved. That's the important thing there. Performance requirements can't be merged together and they have to be independently satisfied. And the example is using PV under H6P2, where it belongs, energy usage, to offset a lower star rating under H6P1. That situation merges together two performance requirements where you're using H6P2 to offset H6P1. So you'll merge them together and it's not going to achieve the actual required outcome. And that's our performance solutions covered. And we'll move into the governing requirements. So one of the big changes in the governing requirements comes under the evidence of suitability part. So we've got A5G9, NATAS evidence of suitability, that states that a certificate must be issued in accordance with the NATAS scheme. So if you're using evidence of suitability and you're going to rely on a certificate, that certificate has to be a NATAS certificate issued in the scheme. So if you're using NATAS, be it performance or DTS, that still applies if you've chosen that evidence of suitability pathway. Importantly, it is only applicable to NATAS pathways. So if you're using the verb, which is going to be using different software, then you're not going to need a NATAS certificate to go with that because it's different software. So another question that we get asked regularly, is a NATAS accredited assessor required under the evidence of suitability change? And the answer is no, because the NATAS rules for certificate are different to an assessor's accreditation process. If you are going to rely on a non-accredited assessor, there's probably more checks and balances that you need to go through to ensure that that is compliant. And VBA's practice note EE03 can give you more details on that. But importantly, A5G9 doesn't mandate the use of an accredited assessor, but generally speaking, the data shows that almost all the assessments are done by accredited assessors, like 99% plus. State and territory variations are another governing requirement that's changed, and the energy efficiency variation from the 2019 has been deleted into 2022. So that variation covered, as a rule of thumb, we talk about solar hot waters or rainwater tanks. So moving into 2022, that's no longer there. So what does that mean during the transition? So if you're using the 2019 NCC, there's no change to the current variation. So if you're using 2019, doing a DTS solution, as an example, you still need to choose from solar hot water or a rainwater tank. As we move into the 2022, that variation no longer exists. So you do not need to select between a solar hot water or a rainwater tank, because a lot of this is picked up through the whole of home. Now, there may be future regulatory changes that talk about rainwater tanks or the like, but that's sort of forecasting way ahead. There's nothing at the moment. And another one is ensure that the plumbing regulations are also complied with, and they are aligning with NCC 2022 as well. Now we'll have a look at the transition from NCC 2019 through to NCC 2022. Now this was recently updated, so 1st of May 23, there's an optional uptake. So you can choose whether you want to use 2019 or 2022. From the 1st of May 24, it becomes mandatory. So that was originally 1st of October 23, and it's been moved out 6 months to 1st of May 24. Beyond 1st of May 24, there's still scope to use the 2019 NCC in theory. Section 10 of the Building Act applies in those circumstances. But the key date, really, 1st of May 2024 is when the energy efficiency provisions become mandatory outside of Section 10. If we look at Section 10, we've got that cut and paste there on the screen. But Section 10 allows for an old regulation to be used and so on. I won't go into detail there, but if you're looking at guidance on that, Minister's Guidance 13 provides a greater detail of what can be accepted. It's important to note that the building surveyor has discretion in applying Section 10, and therefore it may not be a given in every scenario. The building surveyor will still need to consider and make a decision as to whether it is relevant or not. You've also got the Building Appeals Board if a decision can't be reached as well. But it's really important to note that the Section 10 or the use of Section 10 is not an absolute given. We still have to go through a decision-making process with the RBS. If we look at the transition, so we've got notes in the NCC talking about when certain things apply, and we've got the H6 note there, which gave us the transition to 1st of October 23. Now, there's going to be regulation changes that extend that to the 1st of May 24. But if we go back to this, the notes apply to the NCC parts only. So this note is only applicable to H6, and it applies to that whole part. So you can't just pick certain parts from H6 of 2022 and then certain parts of the 2019 code. If you're going to apply H6, you need to apply it as a whole. Now, notes are mandatory instructions, so it forms part of the governing requirements of what must be adhered to, but can be modified through regulations. An example of this is we could have a compliant assessment where we're looking at 2019 for energy efficiency and 2022 for condensation management. Now, they're under different parts of the NCC, so they can be different parts of the code. But again, you couldn't say pick a 6-star for energy efficiency, and then whole of home through 2022, because you're starting to separate the actual part of the NCC. Alterations and additions, another hot topic for everyone. So NCC compliance, the stringency has increased under the code, but the compliance mechanism, so referring back to A2G1, how the code is actually satisfied, that compliance mechanism remains unchanged. So yes, we have an increase in stringency, but our mechanisms stay the same. And we still have regulation 233 under the building regulations, which allows the consent to partial compliance. And again, that has remained unchanged through the NCC. So ultimately, while we do have an increase in stringency, all our processes and our consent to partial compliance process is unchanged. And a quick quiz. Okay, if we run through these, the verb relies on which compliance pathway. The verification method is a performance solution. So you still have all those things you need, performance-based design brief, etc., for a performance solution with that verification method. When using a DTS approach under NCC 2022, is a solar hot water or rainwater tank required? No, that variation has been deleted in the 2022 edition. Under a performance solution, using high efficiency appliance is a reasonable means of offsetting a reduced thermal performance star rating. And that's a false, because high efficiency appliances form part of performance requirement H6P2 for energy usage, and thermal performance and star rating is H6P1, so they're two separate performance requirements. And the last one, using 2019 for condensation management and 2022 for energy efficiency is permitted during the transition period. True, they're in separate parts of the NCC. So concluding, we've gone through and we've provided a broader overview of energy efficiency compliance within NCC 2022. We're really focused on that regulatory structure of it, not so much the actual ins and outs of all the finer details. What the regulator wants, what VBA wants, is for people to comply with the NCC more broadly. So we've given you more of an insight into that. We've covered off on Victorian specific changes. And at the end of this, you should have a clear understanding of what energy efficiency compliance within NCC 2022 looks like.
Okay, thank you very much, Sean. That was great. There's a lot of great information there, and there was also quite a number of quite good questions and thoughtful questions in the chat, which is great to see. So just a reminder, any questions that we haven't yet been able to answer, we'll take away and we'll collate all of the unanswered questions and provide that to everyone within a couple of weeks, as well as all the questions that have been answered, and that'll get circulated, so you'll be able to have a response to your question there. So that concludes the educational slide section, but we'll move on to the pre-submitted questions that we received during the registration process. And we'll kick off with question 1 for Sean. So Sean, what are some of the practical and cost-effective ways to achieve a 7-star rating?
Thanks, Luke. This is a common question that we get asked, the VBA gets asked along these lines. But I'll go back to the core focus of the VBA through this whole process is regulating against the building standards. We don't do the formulation of the particular standards. We don't go out and do the regulatory impact statement to help address those. We're really focused on the regulating. So we don't necessarily give that really specific design advice and the cost-effective design advice to get there. However, that said, I have to preface it with that. There's numerous agencies, be that Commonwealth or state, will give you various design ideas or processes to achieve this outcome. So if you look at the Commonwealth level, you've got NADAs, you've got ABCB, who all have really valuable information contained on their website that you can use to help formulate a design. If we go back down to a state level, we've got agencies such as Sustainability Victoria have some really great info on their website. The Victorian Energy Portfolio, part of government, also has some information there. And also, we don't forget, there's various peak bodies throughout the industry that might be through energy assessors, designers, builders, building surveyors. All these peak body groups do have some really valuable info there that can help steer you in the right direction. That said, some of the common themes that we've been pulling out or we've been seeing through this is the biggest mechanism to make it cost effective and to get the desired outcome is to focus on good design and orientation right at the start and designing the building to really high quality, sustainable design principles. And that's going to give you a good outcome. What we hear is if you take a standard design that hasn't been considered for orientation, so on, and there's a process to up-spec it to get to your 7-star rating, that can be expensive. So it's really key that you think about energy efficiency right at the early stages of design, so that will flow through and not cause you that grief when you hit, say, a 6.5 stars rather than 7 stars and we go back to redesign. So the earlier you get to it, the earlier you apply those energy principles, the better you will be in the process.
Yeah, okay, yep, very good, very good. Okay, we'll move on to the next one. So what's the biggest non-compliance that you're seeing in the industry at the moment?
So some of our data or audit programs and so on from the last few years have indicated that the documentation errors can be some of the biggest ones or most observed. And when I say documentation error, we're talking about generally inconsistencies between the plans at the permit stage. So that might be an inconsistency between the actual NADAS certificate and the NADAS stamped plans, or it could be inconsistencies between the entire energy documents, so the certificate and the stamped plans, with the remaining building permit documents, such as your standard architectural working drawings. So trying to align those and make sure they are consistent is the key. And this is particularly important when you have a design that only just, or it doesn't achieve the minimum star requirement, and you have to go back to the design and up-spec it a little bit. So that's when you often see the gaps being created not intentionally, it's just the gaps come through the up-specking to try to get to the minimum star requirement. These inconsistencies, when we are in that space, the documentation inconsistencies can move onto site quite easily as well, and then we're leading into actual physical non-compliances on site. So just be mindful to make sure all your building permit application and the building permit itself is lined up and consistent throughout. When we get onto site, there's probably some of the common themes that you may see. For example, insulation may be displaced by another trade going in post the install, and we could have gaps within the ceiling where we don't have the coverage. And broadly, just some slight design changes. So you may have a situation where an owner wants more downlights in, so we're changing the ceiling penetrations, we're changing the ceiling insulation requirements. And the same with glazing. We might change the size of the window or the type of glazing. So just be wary for those things when we're looking at it on site.
Yep. Okay. Fantastic. All right. And the final question, just how can a home comply when there's alterations and additions? It's probably the hottest topic of all the questions, but yeah, that's be good to get a response to that one.
Yeah. So yeah, this is the big one, and I think a lot of people are interested in this. So I'd start off by saying the VBA has a practice note EE04 available on our website that will go into a lot of detail, probably more detail than what I can provide here. And that's a good tool to use to give you guidance through the process. But when we're looking at alterations and additions and we're looking at a compliance pathway situation, there's three mechanisms that you can use. You can do your deemed to satisfy, you can do your performance solution, or you can use a consent to partial compliance. In many ways, we're lucky in Victoria that we have the consent to partial compliance. I don't think all jurisdictions have that. So you're in a position where it's more conducive to finding an outcome that complies through that pathway. It's important to note that the principles under the Act and Regs, as I mentioned in the presentation, haven't changed. So that consent to partial compliance through 233, that pathway is still there and it's still the same as what it was through to 2019. And the structure of the NCC hasn't changed. So we're in a same position, but we've just got an increase in stringency that we have to navigate through. So if we have a look more closely at these, and we'll start off by having a look at the DTS, there is difficulties complying with DTS for an alteration addition, primarily because NATAS as a tool has to consider the dwelling as a whole. So when you're just doing work on part of the dwelling, it really removes that ability to use NATAS in many ways. That said, we still have the elemental provisions through the code that we can do, and that's an option to do that just through elemental, but those options are restricted in NCC 2022, and there may be certain configurations that may not actually be permitted through the code. So you could be in a situation where you've got an existing wall that you want to extend, and the configuration of that wall, be it the height, the colour, so on, doesn't fit within the NCC 22, so you can't necessarily use it in a DTS capacity. The other one is you can actually bring the whole house up to compliance with NCC 2022, but we know from a practical standpoint that may not be reasonable at all, and it may be extremely costly and so on. The other mechanism that we've got is a performance solution process. This is achievable. It just requires a bit of work, and there's a bit of, dare I say, admin work through the governing requirements. So the preparation of the performance-based design brief and the process that you need to follow is there. And for that reason, a lot of people don't want to use a performance pathway to get there. Performance pathway can be done, and I use the example of the verb and the underlying principles of it. So if you're looking at performance for energy efficiency, you're probably looking at a way of demonstrating equivalence with a DTS provision. So I say the verb, and I say that in the context that it may not be the verb directly, but it's the underlying principles about how you model the building with a DTS compliant and then show equivalence with that DTS. It gets a little bit complex through it, but it's back to the principles that go in there. So if you're going to go down that path, it's really important that you engage appropriately qualified, experienced practitioners to help you with that, because it can get very complex. And the last one that we all probably know and love is that consent to partial compliance under Regulation 233. Consent to partial compliance is available for all alterations and nearly all additions. So the only threshold where we can't use a consent to partial compliance is going to be in the additions when we go over that 25% floor area, or 1,000 square meters if you're doing a massive house. But it's really that 25% floor area, and that part of the addition has to comply. So consent to partial compliance can apply to all the altered part of the existing house. And that's relatively clear through the actual application of Regulation 233. So I'll go back to EE 04, and that gives a lot more guidance on how you navigate this consent to partial compliance process. And really what we aim to do with it was provide some decision-making guidance for the RBS as to how do they determine it or not. We're not trying to sort of shape their decision. We're really trying to give them parameters in which they can make that decision and be comfortable with it. As we go into this document through the EE04, we try to provide a few examples on how it could be used. We still have the formula, which is the consent to partial compliance, and the formula which we all have seen before, no doubt. And a lot of these examples and the information contained has been generated through DECA, through the energy portfolio of Vic government, through work that they've commissioned and had some really high quality modelling and things done to work out how can we improve building stock as much as possible. We still have a lot of flexibility through the Regulation 233, and EE04 is really a guidance doc that will help shape your decisions. So be careful. I know in the past people have looked at EE04 as the only way that you can actually achieve compliance. It's not. It's really guiding you towards a reasonable outcome. And the reasonable outcome is the key here. We want to make sure that it's balanced and it's reasonable. We don't want to say we need to demolish all houses and build a new one just to get the energy rating there. We want to hit that middle ground and get a balanced, sensible outcome effectively. And lastly, if all else fails, if a reasonable decision can't be agreed upon by all parties and so on, we do have the option of going to the Building Appeals Board, where you could seek either a modification to the regulations, or they can determine if it does or does not comply. So there's various ways there, but I think ultimately familiarise yourself with the VBA practice note EE04, and that can give you some guidance through this process.
Beautiful. Thanks, Sean. That's quite a number of pathways there. So hopefully that provides some clarity with for people. So look, just thanks again, Sean. That's been a great presentation, and I also like to thank everyone for joining us, and I hope you've enjoyed the session and taken some value from it. So as I've said a couple of times, we'll collate all of the questions we haven't got to, and we'll get them out to you and publish those in the coming weeks. And we'll soon be sending an email that includes a webinar survey. So we'd love to get your feedback, and as well as the proof of attendance in the link to today's webinar and slideshow. So as I said before, this was a rescreening of the presentation was a rescreening of Energy Efficiency Volume 2. We'll be rescreening Energy Efficiency Volume 1 in a couple of weeks, and then we'll move to newly formed presentations, newly formed webinars on a number of topics throughout the year. So with our next topic being livable housing. So to find out more about our future practitioner education series webinars, please visit our website and keep an eye out for email notifications. Thanks again to everyone for joining us, and enjoy the rest of your day.